The name on the chart stopped my heart before the monitors ever had the chance to. I'd read 1,000 transfer files in my career, scanned 1,000 names without a second thought, but this one landed like a hand closing around my throat. Ezra Kingsley, age 36, post-surgical complication, hemorrhage risk, critical but stable. I sat in my office chair, unable to move, unable to breathe properly, staring at 6 letters that used to mean everything to me and now meant a decision I had exactly 90 seconds to make: walk away and let someone else handle it, or walk onto that operating floor and face the one man I'd spent 6 years trying not to think about. I chose to walk onto that floor. And by the time the sun came up, nothing in my life would ever be simple again. Not the hospital I'd built with my own 2 hands. Not the son sleeping down the hall who had no idea his father was 2 floors above him. And certainly not the secret I was about to walk straight into the middle of. If stories like this one keep you watching until the very end, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button now, because I promise you, what happened next in that hospital changed everything I thought I understood about the man I once loved, and about the woman who tried to erase me from his life. But to understand how I ended up standing over the unconscious body of him, in a hospital that bore no name but mine, I need to take you back to the beginning, to a Tuesday night on a quiet stretch of road, and a nurse who didn't yet know what she was walking into. My name is Delphine Marchetti, and 6 years ago, I was told my love was worth exactly $2 million. That's the number Vivienne Kingsley put on the table the night she asked me to disappear from her son's life. What she didn't count on was what I would build with that money, or that 6 years later, fate would drag her son through my front doors, into the one place on earth where I finally held all the power. Ashgrove Falls doesn't see much traffic on Route 9. It's the kind of town where everyone knows the shape of everyone else's week before it happens. Who's working the early shift at the plant, whose kids play travel soccer, which families still go to church on Sunday out of habit rather than faith. So when a silver sedan wrapped itself around a guardrail just past the old mill bridge on a Tuesday night in early spring, the whole ER felt it before the call even came through, the way a small town always feels its own tragedies coming. I was the one who met the ambulance at the bay doors. I remember the paramedics shouting vitals over the wind, the gurney wheels catching against the curb, and the man strapped to it, blood at his temple, one arm braced wrong against his chest, eyes barely open but somehow still looking for something. "Sir, can you hear me? I need you to stay with me," I said, my hand finding his uninjured one as we wheeled him through the doors, the fluorescent light overhead sliding across his face in long, uneven strips. His eyes found mine for half a second, unfocused but present. "The other car," he managed, his voice barely more than breath. "Is the other driver okay?" There was no other car. He'd swerved to avoid a deer and hit the rail alone, the kind of accident that happens a dozen times a year on that stretch of road, mostly to teenagers driving too fast or deer moving too carelessly. But I didn't correct him right away. I let him have that moment of decency, that reflex towards someone else's safety before his own. I had no idea in that moment that the man asking about a stranger who didn't exist was about to become the center of my entire life. I also had no idea what his last name would cost me. We got him stabilized within the hour: fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, a concussion that would keep him disoriented for days, internal bruising that would need close monitoring, but nothing that wouldn't heal with time and care. I remember charting his intake at nearly midnight, my hand steady out of habit even as my mind kept circling back to the strange, quiet gravity of him. The way he'd apologized to the paramedics for being difficult. The way he'd thanked me by name before I'd even told him what it was, reading it off my badge in the middle of triage like some part of him needed to make that small human connection even while his body was falling apart. It was only the next morning, listening to 2 senior nurses gossip by the coffee station, that I learned what his name meant in this town. Kingsley, one of them whispered, lowering her voice like the walls might report back to someone important. As in Kingsley Holdings, as in half the buildings downtown and that new development out past the highway. He's the one who took over after his father passed, the other added. 30-something, never married. His mother runs everything else from what I hear, the foundation, the social calendar, probably his whole life if you ask around town. I didn't think much of it then. I had no way of knowing his mother had already picked out the woman she intended him to marry, long before he ever landed in my care. A woman named Margaret Faulkner, raised for exactly this kind of life, waiting patiently for a call that hadn't come yet. I had no idea how far Vivienne Kingsley would go to make sure it still did. I was assigned to his recovery for the full 6 weeks he stayed at Ashgrove General, rotating through morning and evening checks, dressing changes, physical therapy assists, the long, slow choreography of watching a body put itself back together. The first week, he barely spoke beyond what the pain allowed, clipped answers, polite nods, the careful stillness of a man used to controlling every room he walked into, suddenly stripped of that control entirely. I'd change his dressings in near silence, check his vitals, note his progress in the chart, and leave. It was routine. It was easy in those early days to keep him at arm's length, just another patient in a long line of patients. By the second week, something in him started to loosen. I'd come in to check his vitals and find him already watching the door, waiting. "You're early today," he said once, though I wasn't. "I'm exactly on time," I told him. "You've just been counting the minutes." He smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from him since the accident, unguarded in a way that caught me off guard right back. Guilty. We started talking beyond the necessary. He told me about his father, dead 8 years now, a heart attack in his own office at 51, found by his own assistant on a Tuesday morning that Ezra said he still remembered in strange, specific detail. The smell of coffee that had gone cold on the desk, the way the light came through the window at exactly the wrong angle. He told me how he'd been pulled out of business school with 2 semesters left to take over a company he'd never wanted. How the board had welcomed him with the kind of polite condescension reserved for the son of a man they'd actually respected. He told me about the version of himself that existed before all of that, a kid who wanted to study architecture, who used to sketch buildings in the margins of his textbooks instead of the balance sheets he was supposed to be memorizing, who once built an entire scale model of the county courthouse out of cardboard and glue for a school project, and still had it somewhere in a closet he never opened anymore. I told him about growing up the daughter of a factory worker and a man who left before I turned 10, about the particular kind of quiet that settles over a house when there's one income instead of 2, about choosing nursing not out of some noble calling, but because it was one of the only paths out of Ashgrove Falls that didn't require money I didn't have. And then, somewhere along the way, becoming a calling anyway, the kind of work that made sense of all the hard years before it. "You could have left," he said one evening, propped up against the pillows watching me chart. "Gone somewhere bigger. Why stay?" "Because staying and building something here felt more honest than running somewhere else and starting from nothing," I said. "I like proving people wrong about what a place like this can become, including myself." He looked at me for a long moment after that, like he was recalculating something. "I don't think I've ever met anyone who talks about their own life like it's a project they're proud of," he said. "Most people I know talk about their lives like a burden they're managing." "Maybe you know the wrong people," I said. "I'm starting to think you might be right." By week 3, the conversations had a different weight to them. Longer pauses, quieter admissions, the particular kind of honesty that only seems to happen at 2 in the morning in a hospital room, when the rest of the world has gone dark and it feels like the only 2 people awake in it. I'd sit in the chair beside his bed after my shift technically ended, telling myself I was only staying to monitor his pain levels, both of us knowing that wasn't really true anymore. "You always come in during my worst moments," he told me that week, his voice rough with painkillers and something softer underneath. "But somehow you're the best part of my day." "That's just the medication talking," I said, even as my pulse betrayed me. "The medication wore off 2 hours ago," he said, and he wasn't smiling when he said it. I should have transferred his case to another nurse right then. I knew the line I was standing on, and I knew exactly how thin it had already worn. I didn't ask for the transfer. I told myself I could hold the professional distance even as I felt it collapsing, week by week, into something I no longer had any interest in stopping, and that single decision would end up costing me more than I could have imagined, and giving me more than I ever thought I deserved. By week 4, his physical therapist started teasing me about it, the way I lingered, the way I volunteered for his sessions even when they weren't on my rotation. "You're not exactly subtle," she told me once in the supply room, not unkindly. "Just be careful. That family plays by different rules than the rest of us." That same week, I sat with him through a particularly difficult session, his shoulder still weeks away from full range of motion, his frustration boiling over in a way I hadn't seen from him before. "I used to be good at things," he said, gripping the resistance band like it had personally wronged him. "I used to be good at a lot of things. Now I can't even lift my arm above my head without wanting to put my fist through a wall." "You're 6 weeks out from a car accident that could have killed you," I said. "Give yourself the same patience you'd give anyone else in this room." "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, quieter now. "Extend patience to myself. It's not really a Kingsley skill." "Then let's practice," I said, and I stayed an extra 40 minutes that afternoon, well past the end of my shift, walking him through the exercises again, slower this time, until his shoulder moved another 6 degrees further than it had that morning, and something in his face shifted from frustration into something closer to hope. I didn't listen. Some part of me, even then, understood the warning and chose not to hear it, the way people do when they're already too far in to want to see clearly. By week 5, we weren't pretending anymore. He'd ask the day nurse to page me even for things that didn't need a nurse. I'd find reasons to linger past my shift, sitting in the chair beside his bed long after my charting was done, talking about nothing and everything until a supervisor would eventually clear her throat in the doorway, unimpressed but not unkind about it. Margaret Faulkner visited twice that same week, sent by Vivienne, flowers in hand, sitting at his bedside in dresses that cost more than my monthly rent, asking him questions about their mutual friends and the charity gala he was missing. I watched him be polite to her, answering her questions in the careful, distant way people answer questions from someone they've known too long to be rude to, but too little to actually want around. I watched him be nothing more than that. And I watched Vivienne watching me watch them, filing something away behind her eyes that I wouldn't understand the full weight of for weeks. There was a night in week 5 I still think about more than almost any other from that hospital stay. A storm had knocked out power to half the county, and Ashgrove General ran on generator backup for nearly 6 hours. Dim emergency lighting turning every hallway into something quieter and stranger than usual. I checked on him twice that night, more often than necessary, and the second time I found him wide awake, staring at the dark window, his good hand tapping an anxious rhythm against the blanket. "Can't sleep?" I asked. "Never could during storms," he admitted. "My father used to work through them at his desk like nothing was happening. I think some part of me always associated staying calm during a storm with being a good Kingsley. I never quite managed it." I pulled the chair closer and sat with him in the dim light, neither of us saying much for a long while, just listening to the rain against the window and the low hum of the generator somewhere below us. "I don't think staying calm during every storm makes you strong," I finally said. "I think it just means you never let anyone see what it costs you." He turned to look at me, something unguarded in his expression that the medication alone couldn't explain. "You see it anyway," he said. "I don't know how you do that." 6 years of nursing," I said. You learn to read people who have stopped trying to perform for you. Is that what I'm doing right now, not performing? I think it might be the first time, I said, and he reached for my hand in the dark, and neither of us let go until the power came back on an hour later. By the time he was discharged in week 6, there was nothing professional left to protect. He held my hand for a long moment at the door of Ashgrove General, other patients and staff moving around us like we weren't standing in the middle of something enormous. I don't know how to thank you, he said, for 6 weeks of making the worst thing that ever happened to me feel like it might have been worth it. You don't have to thank me, I said, just get better. That's not really an option, he said. Getting better means I stop having a reason to come back here. You'll find a reason, I told him, and I meant it as a joke, and it turned out to be a promise neither of us understood the true cost of yet. I told myself once he was gone, that would be the end of it. A patient goes home, a nurse moves on to the next case, and whatever had grown between us over 6 weeks would fade the way hospital connections usually do, dissolved back into the ordinary rhythm of 2 separate lives. It didn't fade. He came back to Ashgrove Falls twice that first week, both times with a thin excuse about a follow-up he didn't actually need. Your incision looks fine, I told him the second time, only half pretending to examine the healing scar along his ribs in the small exam room I'd borrowed for the appointment he'd made up an excuse to book. You really didn't need to drive an hour for this. I don't actually need to be here, he admitted, standing in the hospital parking lot on a Saturday afternoon, hands in his pockets, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen him in 6 weeks of broken ribs and worse. I just wanted to see you outside a hospital room, at least once, before I convinced myself this was only ever about the medication and the fear of dying alone in a car. And now that you're here, I asked. Now I'm terrified for an entirely different reason, he said. What followed was 4 months I still think about more than I'll ever admit out loud. He'd drive out from the city on weekends, sometimes staying 2 nights, sometimes just for an afternoon when his schedule didn't allow more. We'd walk along the river past the old mill bridge where his accident happened, as if neither of us could resist circling back to the place that started everything, standing at the exact spot where the guardrail had been repaired, saying nothing, just letting the water move past us in the particular silence that only happens between 2 people who have stopped needing to fill every quiet moment with words. He taught me to appreciate wine I couldn't otherwise afford, holding a glass up to the light and explaining things I only half listened to, because I was too busy watching the way his hands moved when he talked about something he loved. I taught him, in return, how to properly change a tire on the side of a rural highway when his car broke down outside town, because some things a Kingsley never learns growing up with drivers on call. You're better at this than I am, he said, crouched beside the flat tire, hands already dirty in a way I suspected they'd rarely been before. Most people are better at this than you, I said. That's not an insult, it's just math. He laughed at that harder than the joke deserved, the kind of laugh that comes from someone who doesn't get to laugh freely very often. I met his best friend from college once, at a diner outside of town, somewhere his mother would never think to look. His name was Callum, and he spent most of the dinner looking between the 2 of us like he was watching something he'd been waiting years to see happen. He talks about you like you're the only interesting thing that's ever happened to him, Callum told me when Ezra excused himself to the restroom. I've known him 12 years. I've never heard him talk about anyone like this. Not even close. Should I be worried that's a low bar? I asked, only half joking. You should be worried it's not, Callum said. He spent his whole adult life dating people who make sense on paper. You clearly don't make sense on paper to anyone but him. That's the part that scares me a little for both of you. Ezra met my mother twice, and she adored him instantly, in the uncomplicated way people do before they know enough to worry about consequences. She fed him dinner in our small kitchen, asked him questions about his work that had nothing to do with money, laughed too loud at his jokes the way mothers do when they're trying to signal approval. She told me afterward, drying dishes at the sink, that he looked at me the way my father should have looked at her. I didn't correct her because I already suspected she was right, and because some small, hopeful part of me wanted badly to believe it. There was a night, sometime in month 3, when we sat on the tailgate of his truck out past the mill, and he told me, almost offhand, that he'd started imagining what it might look like to actually build a life somewhere like Ashgrove Falls instead of the city his family had always expected of him. "I know how that sounds," he said. "Like I'm getting ahead of myself." "A little," I admitted. "I don't care," he said. "I've spent my whole life being careful about getting ahead of myself. I'm tired of it." There was a weekend, near the end of month 2, when he brought me to see the Kingsley Holdings offices downtown, walking me through hallways lined with portraits of his father and grandfather, both men wearing the same faintly stern expression, as if disapproval had simply been passed down along with the company itself. He stopped in front of his own office door, hand resting on the frame, and told me he sometimes felt like a tenant in his own life, occupying a role built for someone else entirely. "Then don't occupy it the way they did," I said. "Build something that actually feels like yours." "I don't know how," he admitted. "I've never been allowed to find out." "You have now," I said, and I watched something shift behind his eyes, like a door he hadn't realized was locked quietly coming open. For 4 months, I let myself believe that a Kingsley and a Marchetti could simply choose each other, the way ordinary people do, without anyone's permission. I should have known better. I'd grown up watching exactly how much permission the Kingsleys of the world require before they let anything happen that they didn't personally engineer. I had no idea, that whole time, that Vivienne Kingsley already knew exactly where her son was spending his weekends, and was simply waiting for the right moment to end it. She found out formally in the 5th month, when a member of her household staff recognized my car parked outside his apartment one Saturday morning, idling there long enough to be noticed, long enough to be reported back to a woman who noticed everything eventually. She didn't confront him. She came to me instead, arranging to meet at a restaurant an hour outside Ashgrove Falls, somewhere private enough for what she intended to say. I almost didn't go. Some instinct told me nothing good waited at that table. I went anyway, because some part of me needed to hear whatever she had to say directly, rather than let it live as a threat in the back of my mind, growing larger the longer I avoided it. She was already seated when I arrived, a glass of wine untouched in front of her, her expression unreadable in the particular way of women who have spent decades learning to give nothing away. "Thank you for coming," she said, as though I'd had a real choice. "I imagine you know why I asked." "I have a guess," I said, sitting across from her, refusing to let my hands shake even as everything in me wanted to. "Then let's not waste each other's time." She folded her hands on the table. "I did my research on you, Delphine, where you grew up, what your mother does for a living, what your father didn't do at all." Each fact landed like a small, deliberate blow, delivered without raising her voice even slightly. "None of that is a judgment. It's simply the truth of where you started, and it matters, because it tells me exactly how little you understand about where my son is going to end up." "Where is that?" I asked. "Married to Margaret Faulkner," she said, without hesitation. "She has loved my son since she was 17 years old. She has waited for him, patiently, the way a woman from the right family understands how to wait. She understands what his life requires, the company, the name, the weight of everything he's going to inherit. What exactly do you imagine you're offering him instead?" "Whatever I'm offering him," I said. "He's the one who keeps choosing it." "Now," she said, "novelty always feels like love in the beginning. I would know. I married for exactly that reason once, and it very nearly ruined my husband's family before he understood the difference." Something flickered across her face, not quite anger, something colder. She reached into her bag and slid an envelope across the table. "I didn't open it there. I didn't need to. $2 million, she said quietly. "In exchange for one thing. You end things with Ezra, you leave Ashgrove Falls, and you never explain why. Not to him. Not to anyone." I told her she was wrong about what this was. She told me it didn't matter what it was, it mattered what it would become, and that a woman like Margaret Faulkner would be standing in the wings the moment I stepped aside, ready to give her son the life she believed he deserved. "He'll never forgive you for this," I said. "You realize that?" "Never know," she said. "That's the entire point. I didn't take the money that day." I want that part remembered clearly, because it matters. I left that restaurant and drove home and told myself I would fight for what 4 months had built between us. I didn't tell Ezra about the meeting. I told myself I was protecting him from having to choose between his mother and me before I understood whether I even needed to make him choose at all. In hindsight, I think I was also protecting myself from the possibility that he might not choose me at all. But Vivienne was patient in her cruelty, and far more thorough than I'd given her credit for. Over the following 2 weeks, everything I'd built in Ashgrove Falls started quietly, methodically falling apart. I learned my hospital contract wouldn't be renewed at the end of the quarter, cited as budget restructuring that somehow only affected my position among the entire nursing staff. I learned a formal complaint had been filed against my nursing license by a patient I had no memory of ever treating, one that would take months to investigate and could end my career regardless of the outcome. I learned the small apartment I rented had suddenly, mysteriously, fallen through on its lease renewal, the landlord suddenly and inexplicably unwilling to discuss it further, citing unforeseen circumstances he wouldn't elaborate on. I called my union representative about the license complaint. I called the hospital administrator about the contract. Every conversation ended the same way, vague, procedural, unhelpful, the particular kind of bureaucratic wall that only gets built when someone with real money wants it built. None of it was ever traced back to her directly. All of it started the week after that dinner, and I had no idea, when my phone finally rang with her number on the screen, that the conversation we were about to have would end with me driving away from everything I loved before sunrise. "You did all of this," I said, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. "I did nothing," she said, calm as ever. "I simply removed the reasons you might have had to stay. He loves the version of you that exists inside a hospital room and a few stolen weekends," she said. "He has no idea what it costs to actually build a life with someone like you. I'm saving you both from finding that out the hard way." I told her I'd take the money, on one condition of my own, that she never come near me again, and that whatever happened next would be mine to build, not hers to control. She agreed, almost too easily, as though she'd expected this exact outcome from the very first conversation, as though the whole thing had simply been a matter of time and pressure applied correctly. I signed the paperwork 3 days later, packed what I owned into my car, and drove out of Ashgrove Falls without telling Ezra where I was going or why. He called for 2 straight weeks. I watched his name light up my phone screen every single time and never once answered, my thumb hovering over the screen more times than I'll ever admit. I told myself it was the only way to make the ending mean something, instead of leaving it open for his mother to reach into again and unravel whatever I tried to say. What I didn't know, sitting in that car with the phone buzzing against my leg somewhere outside Columbus, was that I was already carrying something his mother's $2 million could never erase. I found out I was pregnant 6 weeks after I left, in a small clinic in the next state over, sitting alone in an exam room with a piece of paper that changed the entire shape of what came next. I sat in my car in the parking lot for a long time before I could bring myself to drive, my hand resting flat against my stomach, trying to reconcile the wreckage of the last 2 months with the impossible, terrifying hope of what was now growing inside it. I made a decision that day I'd stand by for 6 years. I would raise this child myself, on my own terms, and I would never again let a Kingsley decide what my life, or my child's life, was worth. Not out of spite. I want to be clear about that, even now. Out of self-preservation. I had already learned exactly what that family did to protect its name, and I wasn't going to hand them a single additional reason to do worse to a child who hadn't asked to be born into any of it. I drove to my mother's house that same evening, sitting in her kitchen the way I had 100 times growing up, and told her everything: the accident, the 4 months, Vivienne's envelope, and now this. I expected worry. I expected the particular fear of a mother watching her daughter repeat the same hard road she'd once walked alone. Instead, she reached across the table and held both my hands in hers. "You are not me," she said, her thumb tracing slow circles over the back of my hand the way she used to when I was small and frightened of something. "I raised you alone because I had no other choice left. You have every choice in front of you, and you are going to build something I never had the tools to build. I believe that completely." Then she smiled. "Besides, that baby is going to have my eyes and your stubbornness, and God help whoever tries to tell either of you what you're worth." I laughed for the first time in weeks that night, and something in my chest loosened just slightly. Enough room to breathe, enough room to start planning instead of only surviving. There were nights in those early months when I nearly picked up the phone anyway. I'd sit in the dark of whatever small apartment I was renting that season, my hand hovering over his contact, rehearsing what I would say if I finally called. I never did. Every time I got close, I thought of Vivienne's voice on the phone, calm and certain, telling me she'd simply removed the reasons I might have had to stay, and I understood that reaching out would only hand her a new set of reasons to remove me completely, permanently, from a life she'd already decided I didn't belong in. The $2 million sat in an account for a while before I let myself touch it, feeling less like a gift and more like a debt I owed to whoever I was about to become. My best friend Winnie Alaba, who'd known me since nursing school and never once judged me for taking that check, sat across from me at her kitchen table when I finally told her everything. The affair, the payoff, the pregnancy, all of it in one long, unraveling confession that took most of a bottle of wine to get through, though I only had one glass myself. She didn't say anything for a long moment after I finished. Then she reached across the table and took my hand. "You didn't take that money because you're weak," she said. "You took it because you're smart. Now the only thing that matters is what you build with it." "Don't even know where to start," I admitted. "You start," she said, "the same way you start everything else. One decision at a time, and you don't look back to check if anyone's impressed." So I built, deliberately and without apology. I finished my advanced nursing degree while pregnant, sitting through night classes with my hand pressed against the small of my back, refusing every offer of pity from classmates who knew half the story and assumed the rest. I remember one professor pulling me aside after a particularly grueling lecture, asking gently if I needed to withdraw for the semester, and I remember the fierce, stubborn satisfaction of telling her no, that I intended to finish exactly on schedule, and then doing precisely that. I went straight into a master's program in healthcare administration after that, using the settlement not to survive, but to invest. First in a small outpatient clinic, I ran with two other nurses who'd left larger hospitals for the same reasons I had, tired of watching good care buried under bad management. We built that clinic's reputation on trauma response times, working absurd hours those first 2 years, sleeping in the back office more nights than I'd like to admit, my son's crib set up in a converted supply closet down the hall while I finished charts at midnight. Within a year, we were the fastest facility in the region for critical intake. From there, I took a partnership stake in a struggling regional hospital that had been bleeding money and patients for years, brought in as part of a turnaround team, and ended up staying long after the rest of that team moved on to the next project. I rebuilt trust with a community that had stopped believing the place could function, cutting waste, replacing outdated protocols, sitting through town halls where angry residents demanded to know why their hospital kept losing doctors, standing at the podium at 8 months pregnant and promising them, and myself, that I would fix it. 18 months later, that hospital had the fastest improving outcomes of any facility in the state's regional network. I gave birth to my son with Winnie holding my hand, in a delivery room 3 counties away from anyone who might have recognized the Kingsley in his face the moment he was born. And the moment I saw him, I understood immediately how impossible it would have been to hide him from Ezra if Ezra had ever come looking. The resemblance was that unmistakable, right down to the particular set of his mouth when he concentrated. I named him after no one, because I wanted him to belong only to himself, not to a legacy he hadn't asked for, and a father who didn't yet know he existed. I built my career around him rather than in spite of him, taking him to board meetings in a carrier when daycare fell through, letting him nap in my office while I reviewed budgets late into the evening, teaching him to read sitting on hospital waiting room chairs during the years I couldn't always afford to be anywhere else. There were harder years than I like to admit, even if I never framed them to anyone as struggle nights when the exhaustion of building a career and raising a child alone caught up with me all at once. When I'd sit in my car in a hospital parking lot for 10 extra minutes just to breathe before walking inside to be someone's steady hand. But even in those years, I was moving forward, not treading water. Every hard year built directly into the next easier one, the way a foundation is supposed to work. Winnie was there for nearly all of it, in ways I never fully thanked her for at the time. She was the one who showed up unannounced with dinner on the nights I forgot to eat, the one who sat through my son's first parent-teacher conference when a scheduling conflict kept me in surgery, the one who reminded me, more than once, that building something impressive didn't mean I had to build it entirely alone. "You keep acting like needing help is the same thing as failing," she told me once, during his second year of school, catching me apologizing for the third time that month for asking her to pick him up early. "It's not. It's just what family does for each other. You're allowed to have that, even the version of family you built out of people who chose you instead of people who were assigned to you." I watched my son grow through all of it, his first steps in the break room of that struggling regional hospital, his first full sentence delivered with startling clarity in the middle of a board meeting I'd brought him to out of necessity, the day he came home from kindergarten and announced, with total confidence, that he was going to build hospitals too, just like his mom. I didn't correct him about the parts of his father he didn't yet know existed. I simply told him that was a wonderful thing to want to build, and meant every word of it completely. By the time he started school, I wasn't scraping by. I was being recruited by hospital boards across the state, women twice my age asking how a single mother in her late 20s had turned around 3 separate facilities before turning 30. I turned down 2 of those offers, sitting across from board chairs who couldn't quite understand why a young administrator with real momentum would walk away from a bigger platform. Because by then, I already knew what I actually wanted to build, and it wasn't someone else's hospital with someone else's name on it. 3 years after I left Ashgrove Falls, I opened Ashgrove Regional Medical Center myself, in the next county over, close enough to still call this home, far enough that no Kingsley would think to look for me there. I built its reputation the way I'd built everything else since that dinner with Vivienne, methodically, ambitiously, and entirely on my own terms. I recruited the best trauma surgeons I could find, poaching 2 of them from hospitals twice our size with nothing but a vision and a promise that they'd actually be allowed to practice medicine the way they'd trained to. I invested in equipment other regional hospitals couldn't justify, and refused every shortcut that would have made the opening faster but the outcomes worse, even when the board I'd assembled pushed back on the cost. Within 3 years of opening, we had the best post-surgical outcomes in the state for complex trauma cases. I made sure of that personally, walking the floors most nights before I went home, reviewing charts I didn't technically need to review anymore, because some part of me needed to know every patient who came through those doors was getting the exact standard of care I'd once promised myself I would build if I ever got the chance. In year 4, a larger hospital network from the city made an aggressive bid to acquire us, promising my board members a payout most of them had never imagined seeing, and quietly suggesting to a few of them that the founder, meaning me, could be replaced with a more seasoned executive from their own bench. I remember sitting in a conference room across from their acquisition team, A man named Harrison who kept using the word streamline like it was a kindness. And understanding, with a clarity that felt almost calm, that I was looking at a smaller, better-dressed version of Vivienne Kingsley. Someone else who believed my work could simply be bought out from under me if the number was large enough. "We're not selling," I told my board that night, standing at the head of a table full of people who had every financial incentive to disagree with me. "This hospital exists because I refused to let someone else decide what I was worth once already. I'm not doing it again, and I'm not doing it to this place either." I won that fight, but only barely, and only because two of my earliest hires, nurses who'd followed me from the outpatient clinic years before, stood up in that same meeting and said they'd walk if the sale went through. It was the first time since leaving Ashgrove Falls that I understood, all over again, just how much easier it always is for people with money to assume everyone else can be purchased out of the way. It was also the first time I let myself fully believe that I had built something Vivienne Kingsley's money could never touch, no matter how hard anyone tried. I thought about him more in that year than I'd let myself admit to anyone, not even Winnie. There were mornings I'd catch myself scanning conference attendee lists before a healthcare summit, some involuntary part of me checking for a name I told myself I didn't want to see. There were nights I'd watch our son sleep and search his face for pieces of a man I'd spent years training myself not to picture, finding them anyway, in the set of his jaw, in the particular way he furrowed his brow when he was concentrating hard on something. There was one night that same year, at a regional healthcare gala 2 hours from home, when I turned a corner near the coat check and very nearly walked directly into Vivienne Kingsley herself, seated at a table on the far side of the ballroom, her back mostly to me, a cane resting against her chair that hadn't been there 6 years earlier. My whole body went still. I stood frozen behind a pillar for almost a full minute, my heart slamming against my ribs, before I quietly asked an usher to redirect my table assignment and spent the rest of the evening on the opposite side of the room, watching her from a distance she never once noticed, wondering the entire drive home what would have happened if she had. Some nights, sitting alone in my office after my son had gone to sleep down the hall in the small apartment I kept nearby for exactly these late shifts, I let myself wonder whether I'd built all of it, in some stubborn corner of my heart, to prove I was worth far more than the number Vivienne Kingsley once put on a table. I heard about the engagement 2 years in, a mutual acquaintance mentioned, almost in passing, at a hospital conference, that Ezra Kingsley was expected to marry Margaret Faulkner by the following spring. I remember excusing myself to the bathroom and standing at the sink for several minutes before I trusted my own face in the mirror, gripping the edge of the counter until my knuckles went pale. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I'd built a life that didn't need his to make sense of it. And for 4 more years, I mostly believed that, building a life so full there was rarely room left to wonder what his looked like. Until the night everything I'd carefully built collided head-on with everything I'd once walked away from. Ezra had been in and out of surgery for a post-accident complication when scar tissue from the original crash finally, cruelly caught up with him, 6 years later, in the kind of cosmic irony that no one plans for. The complication was rare, a slow, internal narrowing that had gone undetected for years, the kind that shows up in medical journals rather than everyday practice, the kind that requires a surgical team who has actually seen it before, not just read about it. His usual city hospital didn't have that team. Theo Lindqvist, his longtime assistant and the closest thing Ezra had to family since his mother's own health had begun quietly declining, made frantic calls late into the night, chasing the best outcome, not the most convenient one. "I don't care about convenient," Theo told the fourth specialist he called that night, standing in a hospital hallway at 2 in the morning, his tie loosened, his voice fraying at the edges. "I care about the surgeon who's actually handled this exact complication before. Find me that surgeon." Every specialist gave the same answer, some hesitantly as if surprised by their own conclusion. The best post-surgical trauma care in the region for exactly this kind of complication was at a hospital 2 counties over, Ash Grove Regional Medical Center. Theo didn't know the name behind it. He only knew the outcomes, and in that moment, outcomes were the only thing that mattered. By the time the transfer was signed, Ezra was unconscious, and Margaret, already treated by his family as the woman standing closest to him, was on her way to the hospital too, fully intending to be the one holding his hand when he woke up, exactly as she'd been positioned to do for 6 years. Vivienne followed soon after, her own health frail enough now that the trip cost her more than she let anyone see, her driver helping her into the car with the careful attention of someone managing something breakable. I was in my office reviewing quarterly reports when the overnight coordinator paged about a critical transfer, a routine call I'd normally have delegated to the on-call surgeon without a second thought. Something made me pull the patient information myself instead. I still don't know if it was instinct or exhaustion or something closer to fate. I scrolled to the name field and I remember the exact second my whole body went cold. Ezra Kingsley. Age 36. Post-surgical complication, hemorrhage risk, critical but stable. I sat frozen for what felt like an hour but was maybe 90 seconds. Every version of the woman I used to be rising up at once. The nurse who fell in love with a patient. The woman who took a check and drove away shaking. The mother who raised a boy who had his father's exact laugh and didn't yet know it. I thought seriously about paging the surgeon on call and staying in my office until it was over. I thought about it for longer than I'm proud of. But I hadn't built this hospital to hide from the one moment that mattered most. I stood, smoothed down my coat, and walked to the operating floor myself, with no idea that the hardest 4 hours of my professional life were only the beginning of what that night was about to cost and give all of us. I didn't perform the surgery, but I oversaw every part of it, standing where I could see the monitors, quietly directing the team through the exact protocol this hospital's reputation was built on, my voice level even as my pulse refused to be. At one point, the lead surgeon glanced up at me through his mask, some unspoken question in his eyes, and I simply nodded for him to continue, trusting my own team the way I'd trained them to be trusted, even as every instinct in my body wanted to be the one with my hands inside that operating field instead of standing 3 feet back, watching numbers on a screen. It was the hardest 4 hours of my professional life, made harder by the fact that in the family waiting room 1 floor up, Margaret Faulkner sat gripping Vivienne Kingsley's hand, both of them completely unaware that the woman keeping Ezra alive was the same one Vivienne had once paid $2 million to make disappear. Neither of them had any idea what would happen the moment he opened his eyes. The complication itself, as my lead surgeon explained it to me afterward in clinical, careful language, was a slow narrowing of scar tissue around a repaired vessel from the original crash. The kind of thing that can sit dormant for years before suddenly, catastrophically, deciding to fail. If Theo had chosen a hospital with less specialized experience in exactly this kind of vascular repair, the outcome could easily have gone a different way entirely. I made myself hear that fact fully, standing in the scrub room afterward, hands still faintly trembling, because some part of me needed to understand exactly how close I had come to losing him twice. He came out of surgery stable. I stood at the edge of the recovery room for a long moment before I let myself leave, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, the particular vulnerability of a person still unconscious, still unaware of everything waiting for him on the other side of waking up. I told myself the rest could be handled by his care team the way it always was. I was wrong. He woke 2 days later, disoriented, tethered to monitors that beeped in the same rhythm as they had 6 years before in a different hospital in a different life. And when his eyes finally focused on the room, they landed on the one person he never expected to see again, standing in the doorway with a tablet in her hands and a badge that read Chief Executive, not nurse. Delphine. My name in his voice after 6 years undid something I'd spent that entire time keeping sealed shut. He looked at my badge before my face, doing the math the way I once had to. "You built this," he said, not a question. "I did," I said. "Why did you leave?" he asked, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way 6 years hadn't smoothed over. "I called for 2 weeks. I thought—" He stopped himself. "I thought I'd done something wrong." "You didn't do anything wrong," I said, my hand tightening around the tablet to keep it from shaking. "Your mother made sure I couldn't tell you the truth." Room felt smaller than it had a moment before, the beeping monitors suddenly very loud in the space where neither of us was speaking. He was quiet for a long moment, processing that, his eyes never leaving mine. "What truth?" he finally asked, very carefully, as if he already sensed the ground shifting beneath him and wasn't sure he was ready for it. "There's a lot I need to tell you," I said. "More than I can say standing in this doorway. But I need you to know first that leaving wasn't ever about not loving you. It was the only way I knew how to keep loving you without losing everything else in the process." "Delphine," he said, and my name in his voice cracked down the middle of 6 years of careful distance. "Just tell me." I hadn't planned to say it there, standing in a hospital doorway with monitors beeping behind him and my staff moving through the hallway just out of earshot. But some decisions don't wait for the right moment. "You have a son," I said. "He's 5. He has your eyes and your exact laugh, and I named him after no one because I wanted him to belong only to himself." I watched the words land on him in stages, confusion first, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like grief for the years already lost, all of it moving across his face faster than he could organize it into words. "5 years," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've raised him for 5 years and never once told me." "I couldn't," I said. "Not without risking everything your mother had already taken from me once." Neither of us knew, in that moment, that the truth was about to reach a lot further than either of us expected, or that Margaret Faulkner was standing just outside that door, close enough to hear every word. She confronted me the second I stepped into the hallway, her composure cracking just enough to show the fear underneath it. "What exactly do you think you're doing overseeing the care of my fiancé?" "My job," I said, as calmly as 6 years of professional composure allowed. "The same job that just kept him alive. Your job doesn't give you the right to walk back into a life you were already paid to leave," she said, and something in the way she said it told me she already knew far more than she was pretending to. "I didn't walk back into anything," I said. "He was brought here. I didn't even know he was coming." Vivienne arrived moments later and said nothing at all, which somehow felt worse than anything Margaret could have said. She simply looked at me, then at the badge on my coat, then back at me, and for the first time in 6 years I watched something like fear cross her face. Not fear of me exactly, but fear of what I represented, of a decision she'd once made that had clearly not gone the way she'd intended. I had no idea in that moment whether the next few days would end with her finally telling the truth or burying it one more time. The truth came out over days, not minutes, in careful conversations between physical therapy sessions, in moments when a horrified Theo confirmed pieces of the story Ezra hadn't wanted to believe, in a confrontation between Ezra and his mother that I wasn't present for but heard about afterward, word for word from Theo, who repeated it to me with the particular shame of a man realizing how much he hadn't known. "I did what any mother would do," Vivienne told her son, according to Theo. "I protected you. From what?" Ezra asked her. "From the only person who ever wanted me for something other than my name. From a life you weren't prepared for," she said. "I was never given the chance to prepare for it," he said. "You made sure of that." Even she couldn't hold her position once Ezra asked her the one question she couldn't spin. Did she know Delphine was pregnant when she drove her out of his life? She hadn't known. But not knowing didn't undo what she'd done, or what she'd spent the years since trying to replace with someone she considered easier to control. Thea told me later that Ezra asked her one more question that day, quieter than the rest, the kind of question that comes only after the anger has burned itself down to something more exhausted and more honest. "Do you understand what you took from me?" he asked her. "Not just her. 5 years of my son's life. 5 years I can never get back, no matter what happens next." Vivienne, according to Theo, didn't answer right away. When she finally did, her voice had lost the composure that had carried her through every version of this conversation for 6 years. "I understand it better than you think," she said. "I have spent every day since wondering if I made a mistake I can never undo. I told myself I was protecting you. I have had 6 years to consider the possibility that I was only protecting myself, from watching you choose a life I couldn't control the outcome of." It was, Theo said, the closest thing to a genuine confession he had ever heard her make about anything. "I came to the hospital myself 2 days later to speak with her directly, not because Ezra asked me to, but because I needed to look her in the eye one more time, on my own terms this time, in a building that belonged to me." She was sitting alone in the family lounge when I found her, smaller somehow than I remembered, the cane resting against her chair. "You look well," she said, which was as close to a compliment as I suspected she was capable of giving me. "I built a life you tried to make sure I couldn't have," I said, keeping my voice level even as old anger stirred somewhere beneath it. "I'd hope I look well." She was quiet for a moment. "I owe you an apology I don't know how to give properly," she finally said. "I have never been good at admitting when I was wrong. My husband used to say it was the one thing I inherited from my own mother that I swore I never would." "You don't have to give it to me today," I said. "But your grandson exists whether you're ready for that or not. What you do with that fact is entirely up to you." Theo found me alone in the surgical wing break room 2 days after the surgery, still visibly shaken by everything he'd learned. "I need you to know I had no idea," he said, standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure he had the right to come further in. "If I had known even a fraction of it, I would have." He stopped, shook his head. "I don't actually know what I would have done differently. I just need you to know I would have done something." "You brought him here," I said. "Whatever you didn't know, you got him the care he needed. That matters more than you think." I thought I understood the full shape of what Vivienne was capable of. I was wrong. I keep thinking about the version of the last 6 years where you were both here together, and how much of that Vivienne simply erased because she decided she had the right to. "You can't fix 6 years," I said. "None of us can, but you can be honest about them going forward, and that's not nothing." He nodded slowly, his shoulders dropping slightly, and I watched something in him settle, the particular relief of a person forgiven for a mistake they didn't even know they were making at the time. Margaret didn't disappear easily. She stayed at the hospital for 3 more days, insisting nothing had changed, reminding Ezra of the wedding plans already in motion, the families already expecting an announcement, the invitations already half-printed. "Going to throw all of this away," she told him, standing in the hallway outside his room on the third day, "for a woman who ran the moment things got difficult." "She didn't run," Ezra said quietly. "My mother made sure she couldn't stay." "And what about us?" Margaret asked. "6 years, Ezra, everyone expects." "I know what everyone expects," he said. "I spent 6 years giving everyone exactly what they expected. I don't think I can do that anymore." "You'll regret this," she said, her voice finally cracking. "You'll wake up in a year and realize you gave up an entire life for a woman you knew for 6 weeks and 4 months a decade ago." Margaret came to find me later that same day, waiting outside my office instead of a hospital room this time, her arms crossed, her composure rebuilt, but visibly costing her more effort than before. "I want you to know I don't blame you," she said, which surprised me enough that I didn't immediately respond. "I spent 6 years building a life around a man who was never fully present in it. I think some part of me always knew why, even before I knew your name." "That's more grace than I expected," I admitted, genuinely surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Mistake it for approval," she said, a flash of her old sharpness returning. "I still think you have no idea what you're walking back into: his family, his obligation, the scrutiny that comes with the Kingsley name. I lived adjacent to it for years, and it nearly broke me more than once." She studied me for a long moment. "But I watched him look at you the way he used to look at architecture blueprints when we were younger, before his father died and all of that got buried under spreadsheets. I haven't seen that look on him in a decade. I'm not going to pretend I can compete with that, even if I wanted to." She left Ashgrove Falls 3 days later, and I never saw her again in person, though I heard, secondhand and much later, that she eventually found the kind of life she'd always been groomed for, just with someone who'd actually chosen it freely instead of inheriting it. I watched him work through it in real time over those 3 days, not a dramatic rejection, but a slow, honest unraveling of a life he realized he'd been living for everyone except himself. The night he finally called off the engagement, Margaret didn't cry or scream. She simply looked at him and said she hoped he understood he was choosing an uncertain life over a guaranteed one. "That's exactly the problem," he told her. "I've spent my whole life choosing guaranteed things. None of them ever felt like this." Neither of us knew, as he said it, that the biggest reveal of all was still waiting for him just outside a quiet backyard, 3 weeks later, one he hadn't even known to ask about yet. I introduced Ezra to our son on a Sunday afternoon in the backyard of the house I'd built with money I no longer resented. I'd prepared for 100 different reactions. What I got instead was a man crouching to a 6-year-old's eye level, quiet and careful, letting our son set the pace of everything that followed, introducing himself simply as a friend of your mom's. Until
I'm
our
just a friend
son,
of your
with
mom's.
the blunt honesty only children have, asked why his
Why do your
eyes
eyes
looked
look
exactly
exactly
like the
like the
ones in the
ones in the
mirror.
mirror?
"That's a very good question," Ezra said, glancing up at me for the briefest second, something breaking open in his expression. "Maybe I can tell you the answer if that's okay with your mom." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. Ezra sat down slowly in the grass, careful of the healing incision beneath his shirt, and told our son, in the plain, gentle way you'd explain something enormous to a child, that a long time ago, he and I had loved each other very much, and that sometimes grown-ups get separated by things that have nothing to do with the people they love, and that he was so glad, so unbelievably glad, to finally know him. Our son considered this with the particular seriousness of a 6-year-old weighing an enormous fact. "Are you going to leave again?" he asked. "No," Ezra said, and something in his voice made it clear he meant it as a vow, not a comfort. "I'm not going anywhere." Son studied him a moment longer, then held out the small toy dinosaur he'd been gripping since Ezra arrived. "This is my favorite one," he announced, with the sudden, total generosity children extend to people they've decided to trust. "You can hold him if you want." Ezra took the toy like it was something precious, turning it over carefully in his hands, examining its small painted spikes with real, unhurried attention. "Thank you," he said, and I watched his voice catch slightly on the words. "I'll take very good care of him." That first afternoon turned into a first week, which turned into a standing Sunday tradition neither of us ever formally agreed to, simply understood. Ezra learned, slowly and without complaint, all the particular rhythms of a child he'd missed 6 years of, which cereal he refused to eat, which nightlight had to stay on, the exact rhythm of the bedtime story he liked repeated the same way every single night. There was an afternoon a few weeks in, when I came home to find the two of them lying on their backs in the grass, deep in a conversation about dinosaurs that Ezra was clearly losing gladly on purpose. He caught my eye over our son's head, and smiled in a way that told me everything I needed to know about how far he intended to go to make up for lost time. There was no rushed reunion, no instant familiarity, just two people slowly learning how to belong to each other over the following weeks, playing catch in that same backyard, building blanket forts on rainy Saturdays, Ezra showing up for every small thing he could, while I stood at the edge of it all and let myself believe that some things taken from you can find their way back, not the same as before, but real and earned, and finally mine to choose. Vivienne never fully became the woman I might have once hoped for, but she showed up eventually, in small and imperfect ways: a birthday card for her grandson, an invitation extended without conditions attached, an apology that came a full year later than it should have but came all the same, delivered quietly one afternoon in my hospital office, both of us sitting in the same kind of silence that had once separated us. "I was wrong about what you were offering him," she said. "I don't expect you to forgive that. I only wanted you to know I finally understood it. I didn't need her forgiveness to know my own worth. I never had, not really, not since the night I signed those papers and drove away in the dark. I'd spent 6 years building the proof of that myself, one hospital, one late night, one impossible decision at a time. Margaret, I heard later, married someone from her own world within the year, someone who, unlike Ezra, had never once looked at another woman the way he'd looked at me from a hospital bed 6 years earlier. I hoped, genuinely, that she found in that marriage something closer to what she deserved than what she'd spent so many years waiting for. Ezra and I didn't rush back into anything. We rebuilt slowly, the way real things are built, not with a payoff, not with a decision made for us by someone else, but with choices we made for ourselves, every single day, small and deliberate. It took a full year before he asked me to marry him, and when he finally did, it wasn't in some grand, orchestrated moment designed to be remembered. It was on an ordinary Tuesday evening, our son asleep upstairs, the two of us doing dishes side by side in the kitchen of the house I'd built alone, when he simply set down the towel in his hands and said, quietly, "I don't want to spend one more year of my life not asking you this." He didn't have a ring ready. He hadn't planned a single word of what he said next, stumbling through it with a kind of nervous honesty I found more convincing than any speech could have been. That he didn't care any more what his name was supposed to require of him, that the only life he wanted was the one that included me and our son in it, permanently, without conditions attached by anyone else. We were married the following spring in that same backyard, string lights woven through the same tree our son had once asked his father why their eyes matched, the late afternoon light turning everything gold in the particular way it only does for a handful of evenings each year. Vivienne sat in the second row, quieter than I'd ever seen her, dabbing at her eyes in a way I suspect she would have been mortified by 6 years earlier. Winnie stood beside me the entire ceremony, exactly where she'd stood through every hard year that came before it, squeezing my hand once, hard, right before I walked toward him. My mother sat in the front row on my side, and Callum stood beside Ezra on his, grinning the entire time like a man who'd been waiting years to say "I told you so," and had finally earned the right. Our son, 7 by then, served as ring bearer, taking the job with a level of solemnity that made half the guests laugh quietly through their tears. When it came time for the vows, Ezra's voice shook slightly on the first few words, steadying only once he found my eyes and held them there. "I spent 6 years thinking I'd lost the best thing that ever happened to me," he said, "without ever understanding that you hadn't disappeared at all. You'd simply gone and built something extraordinary on your own, out of the very thing that was supposed to break you. I don't deserve the years I missed. I only hope to spend every year left proving I understand exactly what I almost lost." And somewhere in the middle of my own vows, looking at the man I'd once driven away from at 4 a.m. with $2 million and a broken heart, I understood that everything Vivienne Kingsley had once tried to buy her way out of had found its way back to exactly where it belonged, not because anyone gave it to us, but because we built it back ourselves, one deliberate choice at a time, until the space he once left behind wasn't empty anymore. It was simply, finally, home. If this story kept you here until the very last word, that's exactly why I do this. So, if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you, and I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. Drop it in the comments below.